There's a lot of guff about games receiving patches nowadays. Games being shipped half-finished or broken. How that's new. How that never used to happen. Well, Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy released in 2003, and was, to my knowledge, broken until around 15 years later. I remember getting this game for Christmas as a kid, playing for something around 8 hours. I saved my game, and when I reloaded, the door to the next area was irreversibly locked. I restarted the entire game, replayed for a while, and ran into another save glitch. This was pretty well before the era of consoles pushing patches through the internet, so I did what most normal kids would do. I snapped the disc in half and burnt it. That was the last time I played Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy. Around 2017, the game was remastered by THQ Nordic and re-released on Steam with a slew of bug fixes and, well, supposedly it's beatable now. Other than the obvious bad feelings associated with that bug, I remembered it being a charming and interesting game. It was good enough that I was willing to replay it after all. So here we are. The game opens with the Sphinx, a demigod of the Egyptian pantheon, sent out to retrieve a magical ancient blade. Well, let's be honest, it's a lightsaber. We're stealing a pre-Disney lightsaber from a magma hellscape called Uruk. Our companion, Horus, actively hates us, so we solve a few puzzles on our own while he complains. An immediate difference in old game design reveals itself, how low information this opening level is. In a modern game, we'd spot the first enemy, go to slow-mo, then pause, and warn you that the giant laser beam eyeball is dangerous, actually. But here, there's just a handful of tutorial messages to let you know that you can interact with certain objects and how to use new abilities as they come up. Bear in mind, this was a game they almost exclusively marketed to children. It definitely tells you enough to complete the game, but it's kind of shocking how little hand-holding it has, compared to M-rated games of the modern era. After a bit of puzzling, Horus rushes in to claim the prize, but gets zapped by the Eye of Sauron. Sphinx gets his sword, and from here on, his sections become more combat-focused. Obviously very heavily inspired by the 3D Legend of Zeldas of the day. We're told we can escape the underworld by offering an attuned amulet to the god of portals, but a near miss from the Eye of Sauron traps us in the underworld and forces us to use a mysterious second amulet to escape. And cut. We are starting on the mummies section. Well, he's pre-mummy to begin with. Today is Tutankhamun's birthday, and everyone is excited. Especially his family, his brother and aunt, the two evilest-looking sons of bitches I ever saw. Speaking of character design, this game is flush with excellent design. Distinct silhouettes, unusual enemies, surprisingly expressive faces and animations. The project actually started in 1996 as a proposed CGI feature film from a small group of artists in Spain. They failed to secure funding and brought the assets to Eurocom in an attempt to launch a whole franchise via game. With that in mind, it does look like it's trying to ape a Disney or early Pixar style. Soft faces, broad appeal, the usual. I really like the animations for the main characters, but especially the mummy. You can tell everything about this guy from his walk cycle, and the fact that his contextual buttons are sneak and crawl. He's just like me. He's also stick thin, but can do a Nathan Drake 6-foot vertical from pull-up position. Again, just like me. There's a lot of scheming and planning going on in the palace, but before we can get to the bottom of everything, Tut stumbles on his brother leading a cult, and gets yoinked into a ritual. The cult transforms Tut into a mummy, and traps his soul in a handful of canopic jars. Sphinx interrupts, sending the cult and a newly undead Tut back to the Nether Realm. Sphinx retrieves the first canopic jar and heads off to regroup with his master, the sorcerer Imhotep. As Sphinx, we're in a somewhat contained world consisting of a desert adventure island and a bird cityscape. Gameplay here is talking to villagers, solving problems, and then delving into dungeons, dealing with puzzles, all that classic adventure game stuff. It's linear, but hides it well. There's a smidge of Metroidvania here, with two somewhat open worlds that require specific items to advance in certain directions. I realized while playing this how spoiled I've become by modern game design. There's always a way forwards here, but you really do need to look around, keep tabs on what everyone's saying, and just generally remember things. I may have gotten too used to hopping from waypoint to waypoint without really observing the world. Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy requires a slightly more thoughtful approach, with a surprising amount of unrelated but interlocking, bite-sized quests. When we get stuck in Bird Town, we need to track down a handful of lost pearls to get the key to a door, so we can trigger the opening of a museum, which lets us donate an animal in exchange for the zipline handle that allows us to finally leave the city. Again, it's taking a lot of inspiration from the 3D Zeldas, but the quest design is largely reflecting that Majora's Mask sensibility. There's a nearly useless quest log, but for the most part, you'll be trusting to memory and a little bit of chance. The game offers guidance in the form of new items and abilities. When you get the super strength gloves, you better start looking for huge objects to push around. But at times, it does lose the thread a little. Sphinx's combat sections are a bit iffy. There was an industry-wide refining of action-adventure gameplay around 2010, and the games that came before feel comparatively amateurish. Combat is fast in a headless way. There's no lock-on, and the only real option is to press the attack against enemies that are often sprinting in circles, until they get stuck on slight terrain bumps. The movement is just floaty enough to be imprecise when it matters. Every encounter feels frantic and unpredictable. Sometimes you can lock enemies into a combo that kills them before they finish spawning in, but sometimes they'll just skate away erratically. There isn't much of a feeling of impact with the combat, nor is there very much variety to our attacks. We have plenty of items like a shield, a blowpipe, and living Pokeballs, and we can assign them to 3 hotkeys, but trying to use an unassigned item in the heat of combat is difficult. We unlock more and more abilities as the game progresses. Of particular note is the capture beetles. If we weaken a monster enough, we can capture them and either donate them to a museum or sell them on the black market. It's actually an interesting twist on the gameplay. Since most of our health restoration is coming from on-death pickups, there's a bit of decision required here. Capturing too many monsters might set you up for getting an achievement, but it won't keep you from dying in the more intense gauntlet sections. This is also one of the major forms of puzzling as Sphinx. We can catch 2 types of monsters, an exploding toad thing and a flaming armadillo, that we use to destroy various obstacles around the world. It's fine, but feels like an intentionally obtuse method to solve puzzles that is intended to be superseded later by a more streamlined item. Except that never happens. Even at the very end, if you forget to bring enough of the exploding toads, well, you'll have to backtrack and grind out a few more captures before you can finish the game. The save system is brutal. You stumble on one maybe every 20 to 30 minutes, and we have limited health, which the save system doesn't restore, although enemies will respawn when you load a save. Health items are randomly dropped from objects and sometimes enemies, and full heals really only happen when you expand the health bar. There are occasionally respawning pylons that usually drop a single health item at a time, so it's a regular occurrence to camp out by one of these until you can finally fully heal. The game also has a nasty habit of ending long puzzle sections with a fence raising and 3 waves of enemies suddenly appearing next to you. I found myself backtracking all the way through a dungeon every 10 to 15 minutes just to make sure I didn't lose all the puzzle progress, which did feel like a chore and cast a poor light on the Sphinx segments. Traversing is surprisingly modern and feels ahead of the era. We've got classic pre-Assassin's Creed parkour, but also such a bevy of options to streamline movement between the Sphinx's worlds. Portals, speed boost pads, ships, secret underwater tunnels. There's enough options that moving through the world doesn't feel like a chore, and I really didn't expect to find any of those sort of conveniences when I booted up the game. Like all early 3D adventures, the real enemy is the camera. Combined with the relatively touchy movement controls and the full sprint enemies, the camera is constantly confusing the fights. Even routine movement can become frustrating when the camera gets glued to an unusual angle, and it does. It feels like the camera is a physical object and it can't rotate through trees, pillars, props, and so on. This is the most tiresome aspect of the game. The first boss fight involves a huge skeletal bat with a gust attack that knocks you off the edge of the arena. The real difficulty of this fight is just trying to maneuver the camera to see him. Well, that and getting knocked off the map respawns you in a place where you can easily be knocked off again, leading to a little loop of health loss. These kinds of issues don't contribute to the feel of difficulty for a game so much as they just burn out the player. The Sphinx's sections are the main path of gameplay, with the mummy being a secondary character that we drop in on from time to time. Throughout the story, we find canopic jars that contain a fraction of Tut's soul. When we find these, we utilize my favorite character, Basket, to teleport over to Tut. He's been taken to the land of the dead, and his lifeless corpse is locked away in a vault of a massive, trap-filled castle. When Basket delivers a canopic jar, it revives Tut for a brief time. The mummy is functionally invincible, so there's a ton of slapstick gags and a few really well-integrated mechanics that define these sections and elevate the game. As Tut, we treasure hunt, explore, and purposefully blunder into traps. Tut can maintain an elemental status for a time after being hit by a trap, which we then use to activate mechanisms that allow progression. Water removes all the elemental statuses, and they override each other, so these sections require rearranging obstacle courses to deliver a specific charge to a specific trigger. Some of these sections require surprisingly elaborate sequences in order to advance. Honestly, they still take a few tries to figure out, but they're surprisingly intuitive for the time. There's also a great feeling of obstacles becoming advantages and vice versa. You may need to utilize a fire trap to burn down a barricade that unlocks an electrical trap, and then suddenly you'll need to figure out how to get past that same fire trap without letting it trigger and override the electrical charge you need for the next puzzle. They aren't extremely cerebral, but sometimes you'll need to pause and consider your next step. I'd say they're doable in a very instinctive way that really scratches the puzzle-solving itch. These sections just feel good to play. They're relatively linear, and the camera issues aren't as much of a problem, and they're combat-free. The game would be lesser without them. There's only 6 mummy sections, and they gradually introduce interesting twists, like the mummy getting cut into 3 pieces and needing to use each piece to activate a different switch. I consider the mummy sections to be the high point of the game. The plot is vaporous at first, but there's a few threads we follow. Tut's brother was actually the evil god Set, intent on capturing the magical crowns of each kingdom in what seems like a fairly typical evil god plot. The game plays the same trick over and over. We advance as Sphinx, hit a hard barrier, then switch to Tut to find an item that allows the main plot to advance. Once the world opens up a little, Sphinx is tasked with uncursing the petrified inhabitants of a palace and appeasing the god Anubis by recovering those magical crowns. Anubis and Imhotep provide the majority of our exposition. These worlds were once ruled by Ra, the supreme god, who split into 2 smaller gods, Osiris and Set, good and evil. Greed is in Set's nature, so naturally he seeks power and wants to consume the other god, and is corrupting the land to achieve that goal. Sphinx is a chosen one and is out to stop him. There's a weird pacing switch in the middle. The back half of the game feels undercooked. Once we've grabbed 3 crowns, the 4th is gained by just walking across the street and finding a kinda shitty boss. And the finale of the game feels completely ripped out of place. We jump into lava, which sends us to a rocky walkway in hell, which teleports us to the heart of the enemy's castle. There's definitely some chunks missing there. The final boss fight was actually very enjoyable, more so than the others. We defeat Set, weakening him and allowing Osiris to swoop in and combine with him back into Ra. The balance is restored, for now. The Harmony angle was interesting, although as far as I know it's entirely ungrounded from Egyptian mythology and closer to Eastern philosophies. Tut's ending is one of the most obvious sequel-bait cliffhangers I've ever seen. That's another interesting thing. Both of our main protagonists are silent, so their personalities are reflected mostly in the mechanics. Sphinx is a demigod and adventurer, competent, lethal, constantly engaging in athletic challenge, and the Mummy is a durable, lovable klutz, lurching through the world and succeeding despite himself. There isn't much to say about the other characters. This is a fairly shallow game. Few characters have more than a half dozen lines, and it's interesting that we really fail to close out a storyline on anyone by the end. Horus, our one-time companion, switches sides halfway through and then we never see him again. Set hints that Tut's brother may still be alive or elsewise captured, but we're never given resolution on that either. Or his weird aunt or his love interest. It feels like half a story, and it's obvious that they were planning on sequels that never happened. Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy has a lot to recommend it, and also some big flaws. I really enjoyed the Mummy's sections, but he's not the main focus of the game, and Sphinx's world is riddled with persnickety cameras and confused combat. The art direction and music are nice, the plot is incomplete, but much of the puzzle gameplay here is intuitive and innovative, well beyond expectations for a 2003 game. On the trusty pain scale, I'd give it a moderately painful. I'm glad I finally completed it, and it was surprisingly fun. But I think there's a reason this game didn't spawn a massive franchise, because it's just not quite at the same level as the Zelda games it's imitating. It's still a good time even today, and it hasn't aged as poorly as some other games from the era. Well, that's all for my 37th review. I like playing older games every now and then, but it seems like around 2000 is as far as I go. Much older than that, and I have difficulty adapting to those out there control schemes they used to have. That's all for now. Thanks for tuning in. See ya!